Before we start today's show, I'd like to announce that TriitCon 2021 is live. TriitCon 2021 is the convention I'm running with a few other podcasters, and we currently have 45 games scheduled, representing 20 systems, including Mage, Changeling, Dark Ages Fae, let me repeat that, Dark Ages Fae, Demon the Descent, Legend of the Five Rings, Mage the Awakening, Geist, Thirsty Sword Lesbians, and Eclipse Phase. Go to TriitCon.com to register or see the TriitCon channel in our Discord. That's TRYITCON.com. Registration is only $2 and most of the sessions are under $7. Our friends at Carrion Comfort Studios are running a Mage 20 Victorian Age Mage live play at twitch.tv/Carrion Comfort Studios, or just search Cypress and Steel and try and find the video of the ST with a hell of a push broom. You've gone too far if you see Steel Magnolias by Cypress Hill. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson, and today my guest in the city of brotherly love is Griffin from the Story Told podcast. We've talked with Logan before, we've talked with Chaz before, we've talked with Noah before, a number of people in their orbit, and today we add to this cross-podcast peace initiative, as it were, with Griffin. So Griffin, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, thanks. Hello to everyone out there in podcast land. Hello, hello, hello.
And Griffin is on as a guest in two respects. One, Griffin is a fellow Philadelphian, has spent a fair amount of time in the city, and the contrivance for this episode is, so how do you make a city in the world of darkness supernatural? And is also familiar with the world of darkness, thank goodness. Otherwise, this would have been a remarkably dull conversation if he was like, so in Dresden Files, this is what I don't know if you're a fan of Dresden Files.
It would have been me asking a lot of questions about the lore, lot of questions about the lore of World of Darkness, because there's a lot of lore. It's so good.
So it's weird because I used vampire as the benchmark of what a lot of lore is. So when people are like, Mage is so complicated, I'm like, no, it's not. We have we have fewer than 100 books. Like how can you complain about this being deeper complicated? I don't know what you mean. So how did you get into the World of Darkness gaming?
Long ago, when I was a teenager, long ago, I was introduced to Vampire, and from Vampire went to my first Mage the Ascension game. And I definitely loved Mage the Ascension more than Vampire because it gave me a little bit more of a chance to be like a hero, but like not entirely heroic. I remember my first character was a brooding Euthanatos with Arcane 5, so he would constantly be forgotten, but that's just how brooding he was. And so like I don't want to say that I was a complete Pollyanna my first time out. I fell in love with the game playing it, and then started running Mage the Ascension and Changeling the Dreaming, and those two really hit home for me. And that's kind of how I got into it. And then New World of Darkness happened. I switched over to that, and then 20th Anniversary Edition showed up, and I came back, and I was like, oh, my heart, oh, here you are. So that's where I am right now.
On one end of the spectrum, you have a game that entirely consists of modules where it is physically impossible to deviate from the meta plot. And on the other end, you have some physics engine like Sandbox. Chronicles of Darkness is like 1 or 2 steps in from the physics engine. Danielle Lozon pointed out that when the Chronicles of Darkness books first came out, people were like, do cell phones exist in the Chronicles of Darkness? Like, there wasn't enough actual information on the setting to like even know roughly when it was placing. And then you have Mage, Vampire, and so on, which are a little bit closer to that other end of written story. If Chronicles of Darkness were like 2 pegs more meta-plotty, not a lot more, just a little bit more framework to help me get up and go, I think there's a small chance this would have been a Mage the Awakening podcast instead of a Mage the Ascension podcast.
Super.
Just need a little more meat, but that's me.
Yeah. I definitely feel you there. There's a lot of modularity to it. The things that I would recommend from Chronicles are the games that really lean into that. Like, I cannot get enough of Promethean, the created 2nd edition.
Oh, interesting.
But that's a game where you start with nothing. You're a blank slate. So, like, if you want meat on the bones, Promethean's not the place to go. But on the other hand, like, it's so good at what it does.
Oh, yeah. And that's the thing. That it gives you what's on the tin. That
Yeah.
really weird performance thing. Like, there are 200 Prometheans on the face of the planet at any given time. The fact that you have found each other is a miracle. Let us tell your weird little band's story. But like, once you get the idea that every city has a concilium and you have the pentacle orders and so on, like, that implies a structure to the world that should be there, and I just don't have enough information on it. I'm super jazzed about the pentacle orders book for second edition, which is just going to outline the magic of the world, partially because from what I hear so far, all of that is going to be just stuff that you can pull into Mage the Ascension to be like, yeah, guess what? This magical place in Chronicles of Darkness, it's magical in World of Darkness. Who the heck cares?
I know that there's a giant flame war between Ascension and Awakening
There
I
isn't.
don't want to.
There isn't, though.
Okay,
No.
maybe I'm so behind on the internet. I hope that I'm so behind on the internet, Terry.
Well, the thing is, so when World of Darkness was on top, when like we were nipping at the heels of D&D, like, there was enough room for people to hate each other. But now that we're fighting for like 11th and 12th place respectively, like, they're just like, we have more in common, like, we need to band together. Kind of like when George Takei was like, Star Trek and Star Wars fans need to bury the hatchet so we can attack sparkly vampires. Like, there isn't enough, like we need each other. It's very much the same way. In fact, one of the things that gave me like faith in humanity was someone tried to start like a fight, like, what do you hate about Mage the Ascension and the Mage the Awakening boards on Facebook and vice versa? And the first response were like, why would I hate it? It's a different game. I don't play it, but like, I'm not going to shit on it.
I am as big an Awakening fanboy as I am an Ascension fanboy. I just recognize that they're two very different things.
So let's get into it on the Philadelphia side. What is your relationship currently with Philadelphia, and maybe what portion of your life has been in or around the area, to the extent that you are comfortable sharing?
Sure. So, there are a good deal of Philadelphia memes out there in the world that I don't know if your listeners are familiar with, but there's a Philadelphia meme that's like the normal size brain to galaxy brain meme. And like, the normal size brain is, I live in Philadelphia, and it shows a picture of a map of, somewhere in Philadelphia. And then it's like, I live in Philadelphia, and it's a bigger brain, and it shows a picture of Westchester, which is a town nearby. Far enough, like, the galaxy brain finally explodes when someone says, I live in Philadelphia, and you see a picture of a town called Doylestown.
Yeah.
Doylestown is the farthest out on what I used to call the R5 line, but is now called the Doylestown Malvern line, is the farthest northeast outside of Philadelphia that you can get on the train line. And I grew up 15 minutes past that in a little artist colony called New Hope, Pennsylvania, which is the gay capital of Pennsylvania. Whenever I was anywhere else other than Southeast Pennsylvania and people said, where are you from? I would say, I'm from Philadelphia. So I'm that jerk. I went to grad school in Philadelphia, and I lived in South Philly for a year, and then have lived just outside of, like, one block outside of the city limits for the past like 3 years.
For tax purposes, I imagine. Yeah.
Well, for boyfriend purposes mostly. But so I've been setting games in Philadelphia for upwards of 7 years. And that has been Chronicles of Darkness games, and that has been World of Darkness games as well. There's a lot to mine here that I think is really interesting, and I won't spoil any of our thoughts beforehand, but like, there's some good stuff. There's some good stuff here.
I moved into the city, I guess, about 8-9 years ago. I originally lived in West Philly, right outside of University of Pennsylvania's campus in Powelton Village. And for the last 5 years, I've lived in the neighborhood of Kensington. People are like, your neighborhood is up and coming. And my reply is, not quite, but I can see up and coming from my roof. That's I've been active in local politics, just little supplemental community advisory agencies, and I've been participating in that. I'm active in zoning, mostly saying, yes, build more things. My fiance lives 3 blocks from me, which is the greatest arrangement I think a relationship can have. We are under 7 minutes via foot from one another. She's also a Kensingtonian. And I guess this is the first formal mention on the podcast that I'm engaged. But anyway,
Congratulations.
Thank you. So the city of Philadelphia is located in southeast Pennsylvania and is the largest city population-wise in the state. It currently has about 1.6 million residents and in the city proper, but the metro area that it is in is somewhere between 6 and 7 million. It is bounded on the east by the greater New Jersey metropolitan region. New Jersey is the densest of the states in terms of population and is kind of torn between being a satellite of New York City and a satellite of Philadelphia. Camden is our sister city across the way in New Jersey. We're a little bit south of the city of Trenton. We are several hours north of the Baltimore, D.C. area, and we kind of have this useful position as being a convenient place to meet if half of your office is in D.C. and the other half is in New York City. And I've met a surprising number of people who have damned Philadelphia with faint praise of, yeah, we had to pick a cheap place to have our meeting, so we went with Philly, and it wasn't bad. I'm like, I'll take it. Thank you for your tax dollars. It was founded in 1682, and it was one of the first cities built on a grid system. Eat it, Boston. It's the only place where I think I've ever seen the intersection of 3 one-way streets all with the same name. And it is the old city, or the city proper, or the original city, is bounded on one side by the Schuylkill River and on the Delaware on the other side, which is nice because I never worry about us really running out of water. The Delaware is a navigable waterway. It is still used for industrial shipping, and that was kind of the foundation of Philadelphia's early industrial power. There are a number of numbered piers that have some beautiful abandoned ships in them, which make amazing World of Darkness fodder.
Yeah, they do.
Yep. Before the city of Philadelphia was inhabited by Europeans, the land was Shakamaxon village of the Lenape, also called the Delaware, who are now largely in Oklahoma. So the two places where you see a lot of things with Lenape or Lenape in their name and Delaware are like Philadelphia and Oklahoma. And you're like, oh, this is uncomfortable. This is they did not come here of their own choosing. Our largest company is Comcast. Because of that, Verizon works really hard to have amazing network coverage here. So it's actually pretty nice in that regard. Our best known school is the Ivy League School, University of Pennsylvania. We have a number of other colleges and universities in the area. Drexel University, which is noted for being regularly the most expensive college in America. Go Drexel. And Temple University, which is where I got my second degree from. Go Owls. I used to say that ironically, and then we started to win things, and it really confused me.
It is also where I got my graduate degree as well.
Hooray! Yeah, this was a second bachelor's for me. Eat it, Penn State. Philadelphia currently, the population, as I said, is a little bit shy of 1.6 million. Its peak population was in the 1950s through 70s and has gone through a steady decline since then until it leveled off in the 2000s and started increasing again. I think that is important because Philadelphia is overbuilt compared to what it has. Because of its differences in taxes through the 90s through today, a lot of companies that were formerly located in the city itself as a transit hub moved outside of it. So it has this weird phenomenon where the sidewalks are way bigger than they need to be. And when you take the subway through Center City, it stops like every 2 blocks, as opposed to New York City where you're like, hold on, I need to go to the nearest subway stop. It is 1.9 miles away. And there are certainly areas like that. But that's just kind of a rough outline of Philadelphia. What do you like about Philadelphia as a setting?
One of the keystones look at me. Pennsylvania is the keystone state for
Hooray.
our listeners. One of the touchstones is what I was trying to say. One of the touchstones that I go to for Philadelphia is actually a short play by the playwright David Ives called The Philadelphia. And it is available on a podcast called Playing on Air. I can send you the link to it. There's a radio version of it. It's really neat. It's a 10-minute play about 2 people who are meeting for lunch, and they find themselves stuck in different metaphysical bubbles. And each of these metaphysical bubbles has rules to it that affect your reality. It's very Mage.
Yeah.
Each of these metaphysical bubbles has rules to it, and they're all named after different cities. So if you're stuck in a Los Angeles, then no matter what happens to you, you think it's great. You think it's awesome. You can get pig's feet for lunch and think it's the coolest, think it's the hippest new thing in the world. And if you're in a Philadelphia, no matter what you ask for, you cannot get it. And so all of the play, The Philadelphia, the 10-minute play, The Philadelphia, it's just this sort of little skit, is about someone in a Los Angeles and someone in a Philadelphia meeting for lunch. The guy in the Los Angeles explains to the guy in the Philadelphia what these metaphysical bubbles are and how he's stuck in a Philadelphia, and helps the guy in the Philadelphia learn to ask for what he wants by asking for what he doesn't want. And so the guy in the Philadelphia has to learn to ask for all of the things that he doesn't want in order to get the things that he wants. And I think that for me sums up a lot of Philadelphia. Like, there are all of these expectations about the city it was supposed to be, the city that it could have been, and then many of those expectations get broken. You encounter the actual city, as it is, it's this island of misfit toys. It's got big little brother energy because, like you said, New York, the economic capital of the country, if not the world, is one hour to the north, and Washington D.C., the political capital of the country, if not the world, is 1.5 hours to the south by train, or 3 hours by I-95. And between the two of them is Philly, and it's like the little brother, like the trickster little brother, who gets to get away with all these weird little things. It's like, New York is this economic powerhouse, DC is this political powerhouse, and Philly has gritty.
Yeah.
You know, uh,
We're a
I
cultural
guess.
powerhouse. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we kind of are. In fairness, we kind of are. We've got a great art scene and a great restaurant scene, and we have the most
And you
universities of
never need
any
a
city.
reservation. Um,
We have the most
fuck you,
universities of
David
any
Keller.
city in the country. I've got a good bunch of pride for this little city.
I like the fact that I think this city is human understandable.
Yeah,
Like, I don't think anyone has all of New York City in their head. I don't
yeah,
think anyone has all of DC in their head. I think there are people out there that have all of like Seattle and Portland in their head, but that's not really saying much. That's like saying you're really good at chugging Zima. And it is one of those things where I can set a game there. I can hand everyone a simple map that fits conveniently onto one page. No matter how my characters need to get from point A to point B, they have 5 options on how to do it. It has a little bit of everything. And for an American city, it has a lot of history.
yeah.
And that is something a lot of places don't have going for them, where it's like, I set my game in Las Vegas, which was like a sleepy boomtown until a century ago, and then it became known for exactly one thing. Philadelphia is old enough to have had phases,
Yeah,
and in a
that's true.
game, I get to choose those. It's also relatively flat.
It's definitely a walking city. Like it's built to get around in pretty easy.
How do you make a city supernatural? Like when you're looking through, I want to set a game here. What is kind of your process maybe for figuring out what factions that you want to have going on, and maybe picking how many night folk you want to have running around? How do you in supernaturalate Philadelphia?
It starts out with two piles of things, right? It starts out with all of the cool things that you like about the lore in the supernatural lore in the game that you're dealing with. And then it starts with all the cool things that you like about the city. And then you start having to draw connections and look at, like, well, what are some of the themes in this supernatural lore, and what are some of the themes in the city, and how do those themes overlap? How can I connect those two things? The thing that I keep coming back to with Philadelphia is this notion that, like, it's always going to kind of let you down. I say this making a gothic horror version of the city.
Yeah.
I love the city. It's not actually going to let you down. It's going to do a lot of good stuff for you. Please, native Philadelphians, don't murder me for saying that. In like a gothic horror sense, like, this, the story of the city is that it's just like constantly a letdown. It's constantly second place, but there's some freedom in that.
Mhm.
There's some freedom to go, for lack of a better expression, balls to the walls a little bit. There was a hitchhiking robot. There was a robot that was hitchhiking across North America. Someone put a sign on it saying, like, I'm the hitchhiking robot, like, pick me up and drop me off wherever you're going. And so people would drive it different places and take pictures with it, and it made it all across the country. And then when it got to Philadelphia, someone broke it. Someone tore it apart.
Yeah, Hitchbot.
Yeah.
It was decapitated in Philadelphia.
And, like, that's the story of the city right there. And so, like, when you have World of Darkness, which is all of these big gothic grandiose stories, like, World of Darkness is built like a cathedral. You're supposed to start small and then get
Mhm.
bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Oh my god, the horror, the tremendous horror, the awe. Philadelphia works really well as a place where those grandiose stories, like, show up and then kind of get let down.
Mhm.
Like, the air kind of gets sucked out of them a little bit, or broken. Like, one of my favorite things about the Wraith setting that I'm working in with Philadelphia is that Philadelphia in my Wraith game is comparatively a backwater, because there was a maelstrom that sort of knocked it on its butt, and it hasn't really recovered from it. Meanwhile, the capital of the Shadowlands in Pennsylvania is Gettysburg. Like,
That makes sense.
Gettysburg, comparatively, is this giant necropolis, and Philadelphia is, like, struggling to get by. Or if you look at like it's always sunny in Philadelphia, how you have like these little scheming characters who are constantly trying to get the better of the world around them and constantly getting sort of hoisted by their own petard. Like that to me is like, oh yeah, every unseelie character in my Changeling game comes down to it's always sunny in Philadelphia.
Hmm.
Because that's the unseelie court. That's the unseelie court's ethos, sort of for the course.
But it
Um,
sounds like you come up with what you consider to be the notional core of a city, and that
yeah,
may or may not be the same as what we consider to be the cultural role of the city. And then you say, this is what this city is in the world of darkness. This is
yep,
what I think the central theme of that city is, and then you start building onto it.
yeah,
And for me, Philadelphia is that same thing. It is ignored. It is not DC. It is not Washington. It allows for strange bedfellows. My New York City is always a supernatural hotbed where everyone is at everyone else's throats because the
yep,
stakes are so high. My supernatural Los Angeles is an area of almost delusion because it's one
yeah,
of those things where you can make it there, but statistically you won't. And you
yep,
have almost no control over whether or not you do. And that is kind of the metaphysical ideal I have of it. And like my
yeah,
metaphysical San Antonio is the war between how history is remembered and how history is experienced. So I have these different places that become kind of different ideas in that regard. So it
yeah.
sounds like your Philly, as you said, we both kind of have that island of misfit toys that it
Island of
is.
Misfit
Yeah,
Toys.
it's
I
a backwater. For me, it's safer.
yeah.
It is a place where if a technocrat teams up with a Dauntain, no one's going to ask nearly as many questions and so on. So
Terry, I did that in one of my Changeling games. I literally did just that. Oh my god.
the glory of the Dauntain is they're the one people where technocrats will go, even that I think
Yeah.
that guy's boring. Like what's the superpower? I can't remember what it is in Changeling, but it's one of it's one of the Autumn Way arts or something like that, where at level 5 you can give someone an incredibly boring hobby. And I think that is the most macabre thing in the world of darkness. I'm like, oh man, you you get
I collect stamps now.
yeah, take that, philatelists. So we have the city and we have that notion. And again, our goal here is to give a framework of how to make a city supernatural. If you don't wind up using Philly, hopefully this framework still works for you and your city. And this is at least how we view it in the US. Internationally, your mileage may vary. And if someone wants to come on and talk about, hey, Prague is 17,000 years old or something like that, but only 9 square blocks, and we want to do that episode, I would love to talk to that person.
That's so funny that you start with a notion, right? You start with a notion of the city and how it's going to fit into the story, and then you build out from there. I usually think of the notion that like is either the Island of Misfit Toys or the City of Broken Promises is
Mhm.
the other one that I come back to.
The other one I do is it is the mediumest fish in a big pond. It will probably not get eaten, so
Yep.
it has a certain degree of safety to it. It will never be at the top. Philadelphia's population compared to other cities, it is only dropped in the rankings.
Hmm.
Just because of the nature of the Bosnawash corridor, the city itself is never going to have the explosive growth of a phoenix, just because the city of Philadelphia itself is not getting any bigger anytime soon,
Yeah.
but it still has a fair amount of clout. It is
The-
the welterweight champion.
Yeah, exactly. Like the mediumest fish in the pond is a great way to look at it, and like take that idea and add it into a game like Changeling the Dreaming, where the whole point of Changeling the Dreaming is that you're trying to keep the dreams alive, man.
Yeah.
You know, like the world is getting the winter is coming, the world is getting more boring and more worthless as you go and more desperate, and you are trying to keep the dreaming and the dreams and the myth alive, and then add that to a city where like myths happen sometimes but sort of fall on their face most of the time, and then you get a dreaming game like the Changeling the Dreaming game that I ran in Philadelphia was really remarkable to me because it ended up being about the magic of the mundane. Like it ended up being about like the beauty of a septibus, or you know, like the artistic grandeur behind finding a cheesesteak wrapper in the gutter and making a fascinator out of it if you were a drag queen or something like that. a player of mine who played a satyr who was a burlesque dancer, and this player has experience with the Philly burlesque scene, and that was one of my most favorite characters because she had vocal fry. She was sort of a mundane person, but she was definitely like committed to the beauty around her in this very like gaudy way, but very mundane way as well. And yeah, it's the welterweight champion of the it's the welterweight champion of the world.
Did you ever see the absolutely batshit burlesques that were done at Panorama 1256? The place with the eraser head mural on the side of it off of Spring Garden. So I went to a Miyazaki burlesque.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. And everyone's like, now we're gonna do everyone's favorite. And I just yelled, Grave of the Fireflies, and which is technically Studio Ghibli. And by the end of the show, anytime there was a free response thing where the presenter pointed to the audience, everyone just yelled Grave of the Fireflies.
Grave of the Fireflies.
So Entropy 5 is a thing. So
yeah.
You have the current move. How do you weave the history in?
Well, it really depends on the game, right?
Okay.
Because the games themselves have secret histories
Mm-hmm.
that you have to layer on top of the actual history. So you
Mm-hmm.
have to look at stuff that has happened that's relevant or resonant to the game that you're playing. So for me, a great example of this is the 1918 flu pandemic, because Philadelphia was a capital of of an outbreak in 1918 for the flu. And so for me, like, there is a whole world of Philadelphia wraith that is a roaring 20s Philadelphia that is buoyed by all of the deaths that happened during the flu pandemic, and that makes Philly in the 20s, that makes Philly this sort of like grand necropolis that rivals Gettysburg. And then it falls flat in its face because that's what Philadelphia does. In my Wraith game, one of the things that you have is like one of the layers of history is this layer where Philadelphia used to be really, really cool, but it's not anymore. And you can go back and find some of the leftovers, or there are ghosts who have moved on, ghosts in legions who have moved on, who come back to Philly and they're still gangsters, gangsters from the roaring 20s in Philadelphia. And they're like, man, see, this town used to be great, see? Literally one of my favorite Wraith antagonists so far has been a skeletal legionnaire who like cut his teeth in 1920s Philadelphia and who's come back and is like, this place is a dump. I'm going to make it better.
I think for me, it's one of the things where I look for keystone cultural moments.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to look at Philadelphia and not consider the move bombing in the 80s.
Yep.
There was this anarcho-primitivist group called Move, which, needless to say, the neighbors didn't particularly like, but they did not believe necessarily in the legitimacy of law enforcement and society, and had a compound that included a number of people across generations, predominantly African-American, in the Cobbs Creek area of West Philadelphia. In 1985, a bomb is dropped on one of the houses, and it results in 11 people dying, of which 5 were children, and 65 homes in the neighborhood were destroyed. And Philadelphia gains the sobriquet, the city that bombed itself.
It's the only time that the American government has dropped a bomb on American citizens on American soil.
On purpose.
On purpose.
we have a few oopsies that we've done. I'm just putting that one out there. There have been a few nuclear devices that have appeared in cornfields that I'm pretty sure weren't planned, but I don't think that was intentional.
It was C4 that was lobbed from a helicopter onto this house, and there's a great documentary about it called "Let the Fire Burn," that is about the truth and reconciliation process that Philly had to go through after that was done. In my Wraith game, the move bombing is the cause of the maelstrom that knocks out Philly in the 80s, because it's just such a, like, something in the city broke that day.
Yeah. And for me, one of the things I look at are the anti-Catholic riots that went through the area, in just saying that there is no social group so well defined that it will not find a way to split and fight against itself, and just kind of the lengths people need to go when they feel that they are marginalized. As a note on the move thing, that was in 1985. November of 2020, the city formally apologized for it. So a little bit slow on the uptake, still faster than the Catholic Church about the whole Copernicus thing. So we got that. but I don't know if that's the comparison that you want to make. The other things I look to are, one of the things about Philadelphia's rise as a technology hub is that all the major industries of it have no coattails. So, for instance, if your city becomes a manufacturing hub, the thing that is notable about manufacturing is for every master machinist your city employs, you employ roughly 5 additional skilled workers. That a master machinist has 2 apprentices beneath them, a shop worker, plus the management structure above them, and those 5 people support 15 additional jobs, ranging from janitors to clerical workers and so on, in administrative roles. Philadelphia is big in web design and biotech, and they do not have coattails. You have a lab that could consist of 6 doctorates, and they may only have 1 lab assistant and 1 secretary or something like that. The advances that Philadelphia has made in a lot of ways has not brought a lot of people along, and that is one of the things I look to. So in my mage games, there are a fair number of masters and adepts, but there are not a lot of apprentices running around, and that raises some questions. Why do we have these masters here, but why don't they have cabals? Why is it this lone progenitor with 35 dots or something ridiculous who is the sole operator of the Monell Chemical Senses Institute? Or why is there this pair of void engineers who are the last vestiges of Null B in the Philadelphia shipyards? So to me, I look at generally the economics of the area and why they are where they are, and I think that tells me the history that I want to glom onto. So Philadelphia used to have the Navy shipyards. They became the Caverner shipyards, which became the Acre shipyards, which is now just this random complex of weird things where you can get a reasonably good roast pork sandwich, but also Urban Outfitters is there. So that's weird, but also, again, there's a few biotech clusters where you have 4 or 5 PhDs that are working on some like retroviral thing, but it's just them in a back corner in a cold room, as opposed to it being this big company of any sort. And that to me informs my Philadelphia.
Yeah. Guess who used to work at the Navy shipyards?
Everyone has had a job at the shipyards.
Isaac Asimov used
neat.
to work at the shipyards. Yeah.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. He factors into my Changeling game.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. And I am starting up a mage game soon after I finish up Wraith. And so I am taking notes now about all of your ideas. I'm going to steal them, Terry.
Oh, that's entirely fine. When I run a one-shot, it's called Justice Ascendant. It's set in the city. I will share that at one point when it is polished enough for me to share it with the wider world. And to something that Griffin mentioned, we have the 1918 flu pandemic where Philadelphia won in terms of, we got like the gold medal in terms of ignoring it. But also, we were hit by the yellow fever outbreak, and there have been a few other disease outbreaks. So it became pivotal in my story that periodically something comes up from the Dark Umbra, possibly. And I also modify the indigenous history slightly. Philadelphia itself was not inhabited heavily because it was a swampland in a lot of cases, but areas that are now part of Philadelphia were inhabited. But the area did make a good launching off point for a number of other areas, so it kind of became like an intersection on a highway, using the Delaware and the Schuylkill as navigation points for waterborne transit. So in my supernatural Philadelphia, periodically disease is a character. And I think when you build a supernatural city, you need to figure out the extent to which you want the city itself to be a character.
Yeah.
On one end of the spectrum, you have games like Blades in the Dark, where it completely defines the setting, but the city itself just creates the confines and everything else is due to mortal agency. And on the other end, you have something like maybe Urban Shadows, where the city itself is almost literally a character. The city does stuff. It is not embodied as a person. It's like the city does this. So another question when you're building your setting is, to what extent do you want the city to be a character versus do you want it to be a setting? We've talked a bunch about some of our various little bits. What do you make the supernatural factions of Philadelphia being? How supernatural do you make Philly?
I try to make it punching above its weight and always sort of failing. So I think I end up making Philly a lot more supernatural than it should be. Like in my Changeling game, like one of the secrets was that Billy Penn was a Kinane who bargained with the Changelings to sort of help them set up the city and stuff like that. And so there was this whole plot where the player characters had to go and like find the original charter that William Penn wrote, the secret charter that William Penn wrote with the original Kithane who came over. I love the idea of blowing up those stories as big as they can and then watching them fall on their face. So like in my mage game, the idea is that like Philly is home to this one chantry that is this famous academy for mages. On the one hand, you come to Philadelphia because like you can go to this academy and it's really cool. On the other hand, there's nothing else there. And the academy just treats the city as its own little playground for its arcane experiments. A lot of that may be built up tension from having gone to grad school, and just like grad school is a choice. Like grad school is a very serious choice and it always comes with a lot of pain. And so part of me wanted to do a Magic grad school game where Magic grad school wasn't Hogwarts. Like it wasn't that great of a thing.
Yeah.
How supernatural do I make Philadelphia? Probably more than it should be, but I try to make it supernatural in very mundane ways. Like you said, like it's a world where the borders are kind of hazy and you can get interesting overlaps, overlaps between mortal and supernatural, overlaps between different rival supernatural forces. And so like people who end up being dreamers working with Kithane without knowing it, or like people in BDSM sex cult who are totally okay with being ghouls. It's because it's like beats the hell out of anything else, literally. Ha-cha-cha-cha. That is literally the kind of thing where my players and I would look at that and we would go Quaker City values right there,
Yeah.
because my changeling game was called Quaker City Values,
Uh-huh.
and it was all about that kind of like it's grandiose but mundane. Like I'm wearing a giant hat and a felt poncho on a fixie.
So
I have assless chaps, and I'm going to talk about making a community.
and I like your idea though of the William Penn angle as the founder being Kinane, because one of the things that marked Philadelphia is the number of times it avoided being burned down. Where like you have a city founded by Quakers or largely inhabited by Quakers who are ardent pacifists. A lot of people are like, but this war is a brewing. Aren't we worried? And all the Quakers are like, God will defend us. And Benjamin Franklin is like, God will defend us in the form of us buying a cannon. And and so he does this fundraiser for the Philadelphia Fire Department, one of the first organized ones at the time. And he's like, okay, we're going to say our target is actually this much, this huge number, and we're going to say we're going to get a fire engine. And his idea was basically a giant cannon is basically a fire engine. So he's like, yeah, if we meet this minimum standard, we will buy a fire engine, and if we meet this higher standard, we will truly get a fire engine. So I like the idea though that the thing that allowed the Quakers to succeed was Kithane magic, preventing invasion, and I like that as a way to weave things in. I tend to be on the other end of the spectrum. I am famous for how few mages are in my mage games. I don't think I've ever had more than 8 in the city, and that includes the entire metro area. There's about 30 vampires because I treat vampires kind of not quite like mooks, but like you don't kill a vampire. Like the minimum number of vampires you kill at once is a dozen. They're like they're like the Pringles of supernatural enemies. Now there are higher level ones that have fully fleshed out personalities and so on. I like to use wraiths a lot because again, Philadelphia has enough history to it that I think it can have a bunch of that the necropolis lets you blend those weird things together. I also like wraiths as a supernatural faction because their motivations are identical to a normal human's. Like unlike dealing with the alienness of the beast or the desire to defend Gaia or some weird out there umbrood, like a wraith has shit to do. Like
they want to make sure their kid goes to college.
Exactly. I don't speak changeling well, so those are always ad hoc. And so that is my thing. The only supernatural thing I really add is Mage has the idea that there are zeitgeist spirits, that they're embodiments of certain times and places that are out there in the Umbra, and you can talk to the 70s or you can talk to the 20s. I make them materialized. You can run into the 1920s in Philadelphia somewhere buying a sandwich. So I keep them as embodied entities. I want the supernatural in that way to be closer, even if not active. So what do you associate certain areas of the city with certain supernatural factions? Like, how do you do that mapping?
Definitely. So again, it depends on the game, right? A big thing for me in Changeling is that because the Changelings came over with William Penn, there are going to be a couple of places that are important, right? The Shackamaxon Street in Fishtown is home to a bunch of Changelings who are like, this is where the treaty was signed with the Lenni Lenape. So this is where, like, this is a historical point for us that's really important. There's another part of Philadelphia called Elfrith's Alley, which is this little street in Old City that has some of the oldest homes in the country. or not the country, in the city. And it's just it's super cute, it's super tiny, there's cobblestones, it's very changeling. So like on the one hand, there's stuff that I look to for like from the history, but then also there's stuff that you look at where you're just like, oh, that's a blank, insert game title here.
Hmm.
So Philly has an old prison called Eastern State Penitentiary. The idea of a penitentiary is a Quaker attempt to reform prison practices. The idea is with a penitentiary as opposed to a prison, is that in a penitentiary you are left alone in solitary confinement with your own inner light and connection to God, and you are left alone to think about yourself. And that will help you reform. And the Quakers really intended that to be like God will help you reform. And of course, we all know solitary confinement drives people crazy. And so the Eastern State Penitentiary was like unwittingly one of the most psychologically scarring buildings ever invented. So of course that's a citadel in Wraith. I think in the Wraith book they even call it out as a
Hmm.
citadel. Of course that has to be a center for deathly insanity.
And yeah, just going on the Eastern State Penitentiary thing, I could see in a Mage game the New World Order being fascinated by something like that. It was also the one of the earliest proper panopticons where
I
you
was
had,
about to say.
yeah, you have all these radial halls where if anything's going down, there's just this system of mirrors where a single guard can look through an entire thing. It's a great place to do a haunted house, which is probably what it is best known for now. And it's one of those places where like you have to sign a release form where like, oh, how psychologically scarring do you want this event to be? But one of the things we don't get a lot of in Mage is the idea of the technocracy having a sense of history. Like, what are their pilgrimage sites? And I could see an NWO and a syndicate member looking at Eastern State and one going like, this psychologically wrecked a whole bunch of people for a while, and a syndicate member being like, yeah, but it was cheap and we got to try something. Also, we made bank off of Capone when he was here. And just being able to have those conversations is something I like. But yeah,
The move bombing factors in pretty highly into my experience of Wraith, because that's the thing, like
mhm.
that's the thing that caused this maelstrom. But it's also a big element of the city. Buildings that have been torn down that used to be there end up being really important to me. Again, that's because I'm in the middle of doing this Wraith game. So like there was on South Street in Philadelphia, there's like the south of center of the main part of the city was called South Street. And South Street right now is this kind of like, it's got shops and cool little things, and it's a like a fun place to go. And on South Street there used to be an occult store run by a guy named Harry,
Mhm.
and it's been torn down now, but you can find pictures of Harry and pictures of his occult store, and he literally became a character in my Wraith game. He's a mentor for all of my Wraiths. So like finding this little like local enclave of occultism like made me grasp onto that. What are some of your favorite places to invoke in the city?
So one of the things is the overall notion of the city. As you mentioned, there are layers of history, and one of the things
Mhm.
I like is Philadelphia has always had a pretty bustling photography arts scene.
Mm.
Compared to other forms, like we have the Philadelphia Museum of Photography, which exists. You have the Mummers Museum for all the complications that presents, and that was
Yep.
always a well photographed thing. So there are a lot of recordings of the civic institutions that are no longer here. There was a book, I think it was called Philly's Lost Civic Institutions or something like that just shows you public parks and public memorials and so on that as the civil rights era ended were torn down or replaced or rebuilt, and those all go into my underworld. The
Mhm.
Philadelphia Library has a large collection of historical photographs that it's one of those things where it's free unless you want a high-res copy and no one else has requested a high-res copy, in which case it's $10 or something because you need to literally pay someone to go over and scan the darn thing, and I'm fine paying $10 for that. The Philadelphia Library System, we do not deserve it. You can see Malcolm Gladwell talk at Verizon Hall and pay $150, or you can wait until he's at the free library the next day with half as many people and just walk in. It is amazing, like how that trick happens, where it's like, oh,
Mhm.
I want to see David Eggers. He will probably be within my city in the next 2 years, and I will be able to see him for free, which is kind of nuts to me. So we have those layers of history. The other thing is, since it's on a grid pattern, one of the things I consider is I have magically that being an attempt to settle the ley lines of the city. That
Yep.
since it is a city that is bubbling with death, because there is some natural entropic emanation occurring from it, that is a recurring theme I have my characters deal with. So whenever there's a street at a weird angle out of nowhere, there's a story behind that. Like the fact that
Yep.
Passayunk is just like, man, fuck you, I'm going diagonal across everything.
Exactly. Moya Mensing.
Yeah.
No.
I make there a story behind that. To me, when I introduce Navandi into the city, they're often zoning board fights because they are trying to redirect the flow of quintessence in the city to awaken this dark entity I have beneath the city. And much like Grandmother in Orpheus, I have a hard time calling Grandmother evil. Grandmother is destructive, but I wouldn't quite consider it the same as like an outsider thing that wants to consume all of reality. Like Grandmother is just like, how can there be anything outside of me? Why would you not want the unity that is being part of me? I put Mole Hectorus, one of the Neverborn, beneath the city, and the fact that the First Nations people weren't really active in the area was because Mole Hectorus was there. So like let's skirt around it. So I have a lot of my activities being that.
That's awesome.
But the key ones for me that I really like are one, Washington Square. The city of Philadelphia had 5 squares that were outlined in the original city plan. They're all a block by a block, more or less. But Washington Square was also a pauper's graveyard. And I did the math at one point. There's a dead body every 10 square feet there.
I'm stealing that. I'm totally stealing that.
Yeah. So if characters want to talk to a wraith, that's kind of that is their hotspot. That is their nightclub. Just because you have so many dead there and so many fetters, I make the murals of the city in a lot of cases. So Philadelphia also had a murals art program, which was considered it started out as the Philadelphia Anti-Graffiti Project or something like that. And it was just a way of taking kids that were doing graffiti and saying, hey, we're going to give you a formalized system to paint certain areas, and this will be a replacement for you having to go to juvie or something like that. Those are invariably haunts. Almost all of those murals have wraithly inhabitants to them. Some of them are strictly art and beautification projects, where other ones, for instance, the one in Chinatown, kind of represents various attempts at destroying certain communities. When 676, the interstate, was being built through Philadelphia, the original plan was to just bulldoze Chinatown. And Chinatown's response was, no. And in a rare victory stopping the interstate system, they were able to move it. They're like, can you literally go 2 blocks north where there really isn't nearly as much stuff? And they're like, okay, I guess we'll listen to the several 100,000 people that live here for once. So that became a thing. So those murals kind of also become this web of quintessence in the city. As far as literal locations, the SS United States. It is this massive ship that was ran in the 50s, is completely decommissioned, is just full of asbestos, and everything on it was built to be non-flammable. It holds the record, I think, for fastest passenger transatlantic voyage, and it has held that record for 70 years, because generally if you're crossing the Atlantic via ship at this point, it's probably a vacation of some sort, and your goal is not to get there necessarily as quickly as possible. But that is always a center to me, because that is also one of those things where all of the deck plans are available online. So like if I want to make a dungeon, I'm like,
Sweet.
they're like, I go down the floor, what do I see? I'm like, hold on, let me open the next JPEG.
Yeah.
So this is what it's like being a D&D storyteller. Like, so that's a big one to me. The other thing I add to Philadelphia are micronodes. So instead of having there being, again, part of Philadelphia not being on the map is there are no large nodes, really. But Mount Moriah Cemetery has 2 nodes immediately next to each other. Mount Moriah Cemetery is an abandoned cemetery. It's reachable via light rail. It has this Civil War graveyard section. So basically you can collect quintessence by mowing the lawn there or collecting pine cones. Yeah. And I have a number of those where you can do 3 or 4 things within the city, and that nets you a point of quintessence. It requires much more hustle, but it does not appear on the magical radar. If you start doing that, the technocracy ain't coming back, ain't coming for you.
Looking for you, yeah.
Yeah. We have our Masonic Temples. We have a number of statues to Benjamin Franklin, and those all become important. But within the city of Philadelphia, one of the few references in Mage the Ascension to Philadelphia is Nullby used to have an earthly aspect there. To me, that went away when the Philadelphia Navy Yard closed as kind of a naval hub. So I have this abandoned technocrat facility, which after interfacing for years with Mole Hectorus, the Neverborn, has become this dark, twisted reflection. It's kind of like if the technocracy had a labyrinth, I guess you could say.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I want that. I want that so hard.
Those are kind of the big ones for me. But if you're doing this in your city, I seriously recommend just go to Atlas Obscura or Roadside America.
Yes, Atlas Obscura is such a great resource. Another Philadelphia thing that just want to throw out into the ether is the Mutter Museum.
Mhm.
The Mutter Museum is an anatomical museum that has a bunch of like creepy, weird things, including a soapified mummy that they dug up somewhere in the city, and like it has organs in formaldehyde and stuff like that. A skull wall. It's just
A lot of skeletons right next to each other. A
yeah,
lot.
it's perfect World of Darkness fodder.
And one of the things you actually get, and this is easier in some places than others, like for instance, once you go west of the Mississippi, every city of at least 50,000 people has kind of a little bit of everything because it's the only city within 4 or 5 hours in a lot of cases. So like you can go to Rocky Mount, Nevada, and like it has its little natural history museum, and every city kind of becomes this locus of activity in a key way. Any other key locations that you think are interesting or that tell interesting stories in Philadelphia?
Wissahickon Park is a park to the northwest in Philly that has a number of things. It's like one of the only places that you can really access the wild in
Mhm.
Philadelphia. But one of the things that it has in it is a cave where one of the like first Rosicrucians or something like that in Philadelphia came to meditate. It's called the Cave of Kelpius. And if you go there, like it's 10 minutes from one of my friend's houses. And so we went there at one point, and it's just this little cave, but like outside there's a stone that tells the story of Kelpius and stuff like that, and it's got like an ankh and a scarab and a cross and all these different symbols on it, and it's just like, oh, this is clearly something in Mage, something from Mage about like how people from the Order of Hermes and the Celestial Chorus came to Philadelphia to try to bury the hatchet at some point, and they tried to do it through this apocalyptic death cult or something that met or was connected to this cave. So, got to do something with the Cave of Kelpius. There's another cemetery called Laurel Hill Cemetery, which has these elaborate graves, very, very, very elaborate graves. They do Halloween tours there. Like at one point when I was setting a game in Philadelphia, I was like, there is a secret Orphic cult that lives in Laurel Hill Cemetery, and it's how the DuPonts got all of their money. It's got that much grandeur to it. And somewhere in Laurel Hill Cemetery, there's the grave of like a University of Pennsylvania professor or something like that. That's literally just an obelisk that is like spiritualism is the one true religion, and it just leaves. It has like a paragraph carved into it about spiritualism in like the 1890s, because that's what this University of Pennsylvania professor wanted to leave behind or something like that. And so that to me stands out as like a really cool place to just wander around and come up with neat ideas just by looking at gravestones.
And it's become a performing arts venue.
Yeah.
So, like, I get to say things like, oh, Laurel Hill Cemetery, I had the best kimchi of my life there, which is not something you normally get to do. There are a number of stages and a number of areas that were never done out. So, throughout the summer, there's a whole concert series there, which is tough to beat. It is one of the few cases in Philadelphia where I have to pedal uphill a lot. So, the ride home from there is actually quite easy. Um, and it's one of those things where you get to pick what it means. Like Laurel Hill Cemetery could be the headquarters of a necropolis, or there is a group of euthanatoi there called the Necronauts who are using it to explore the underworld safely, because the fact that it is this mixture of both death and active culture has made it so that maybe some of the more dangerous aspects of the Shadowlands are not present there, and it's kind of a safe spot within the underworld morass, or it is considered neutral ground from a number of groups because it is large enough that everyone can live there, or you have this particularly strange group of silent striders that tend to come back there, and it is one of the few places where werewolves enjoy going into the underworld or can do so safely, and that becomes a plot hook to deal with the white howlers, or maybe the Verbena are interested in the fact that there are a variety of plants that only grow on top of marble tombstones, and it takes at least 2 centuries for that to incept, or you have someone who is interested in the arrangement of those headstones and finding the secret Masonic meaning behind it, or a member of House Fortunae who is trying to decode the death dates of this particular row of gravestones that are tied to a family that the city has no records of, or the Nefandi are trying to slowly rearrange a number of these grave plots to make room for something big that they're trying to come through.
And isn't it great just to see that process that you just went through, where you were like, I'm going to take this thing in reality and these things in the canon, and I'm just going to like try to match them up and see how they all fit together in
Mm-hmm.
all of these different possible ways. Like, Yeah.
So we've talked about a bunch of places. What to you are the most important question when you're trying to create that sense of place?
Definitely. I think this is somewhere where you and I agree, is the mood and the theme. Like finding what you think that story of the city is, and then finding how individually it appears in this one little area. So like if Philadelphia is a city of dreams deferred, like what is the dream in this little area and
Hmm.
how did it fall short? Where is the kid who's practicing music in his, in his room, you can hear as a changeling,
Hmm.
because you're like, oh, the dreams, the dream is over here, except that it's being, if everyone else here, can't hear it because there's a SEPTA bus honking or something like that.
Oh yeah, and likewise when I am in DC, what is the power struggle of this neighborhood? Or when I'm in Los Angeles, what is the particular kind of delusion required to survive here? Or when I am in San Antonio, what is the true history and how does that compare to what we think the history is, and what does that comparison look like? So
Yeah.
for you, yeah, mood and theme kind of come up front. And I like the idea that you had of it is just a subtle thing
Yeah.
where you say you come to this area and you hear the kid practicing, and it's a World of Darkness game, so we can really be on the nose. And you say he is practicing his violin for the 20 minutes he has before he needs to go deliver papers, work the night shift, or
Yeah.
something like that, even though he's still in middle school or something like that.
That is a good point, that you can be on the nose in a World of Darkness game.
Oh
Like, you
yeah,
really can be.
we often don't have time to build up the metaphor that we want to, so just hand it to them.
Slap them over the head with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Likewise with plots, people are like, "You're being railroady." No, I am giving you a bus ticket, to quote Monica Specca. And if you want to take the bus ticket, the bus will take you up the side of Mount Adventure. You cannot do that, but
I'm going
I'm
to
just
quote
saying.
you on that. That warms my plot-driven heart.
Yeah. Oh
Um,
yeah. I certainly do open-ended games on occasion, like out of necessity. I kind of have to for Invisible Sun, but like
mm,
I very much like creating a world where the characters can do whatever they want, but there are obvious signs of what is happening in the world, and if they choose not to intercede, things will happen. And generally, I just happen to play with people who care about those kind of things, and then we try and weave as many personal stories into it as we can, as opposed to doing it the other way. And that's just me. Yeah.
same.
One of the things that you run into when doing a city game is some of your players may be from there. How do you deal with that information disparity?
The players that I have who are like, who have experience with Philadelphia, I put them up on, center stage. I'm
Hmm.
like, cool, what does this look like?
Hmm.
Where would this be? Because once you get people, well, if you can get the theme and the mood down and you can clearly communicate that to your players, like there's like, you can do that in game by, making sure that you follow suit and tell the story over and over again. But you can also do that out of game. Like, I'm a really big proponent of Facebook groups,
Hmm.
and using Facebook groups basically to like post content that's similar, and like even just post a rundown of like, here's what I think the theme is, here's what I think the mood is, here's what I think the setting is. And so like people who know Philadelphia, or people who know the setting, are really useful for you, because once they get where you're going, you can just use them as resources, and you can be like, well, what's around here, what does that look like, what do you think that is in this setting, and they'll just tell you.
Hmm.
Then you're allowing a huge sense of player agency to shape the setting, and then you can just riff, and that's great.
And one of the benefits of setting a game in a major city is, unless you're in a place that is very districtized, there's probably a hardware store within 10 blocks. There's probably a place for your characters to duck into a diner if they need to
Yeah,
talk after
there's a
something
diner.
crazy happens. Like you're
World of
probably
Darkness World of Darkness taverns are diners.
yeah, O'Tully's if you want to go in that direction. And that to me just makes it so much easier, where it's like, yeah, there's probably a place nearby that does the mundane thing that you need. If not, there's Uber.
Yeah.
So we can make that happen pretty quickly. And Mage to me is generally a game where like resource access is rarely the impediment. Like if you just need mundane stuff, that's what matter, mind, entropy, correspondence, forces. You'll notice a theme here. Like there's 30 ways to get the thing that you need. For me, the key thing is having a map. because to me, a map does two things. It tells you what's important and it tells you what's not important. So, for instance, one of the recurring themes I have is Philadelphia has a number of bedroom communities. One of them is referred to as the main line because there was a railroad line that went along them, where you have the Swarthmore area where Swarthmore College is located, but also a fair number of established rich families. To me, that is always one of the strange other places where it works very hard to avoid being Philadelphia in a way that a lot of vacation communities try not to be like the thing people are trying to get away from. So that is the area where places tend to have more trees around. There tends to be more quietude and solitude. There's more likely to be something menacing happening behind a closed door in a 2-century-old mansion that is always eerily lit. So when I hand them the Swarthmore map, the players know that this is important. So it is very much some signposting that you provide. And likewise, when I point out those key things, the fact that there's a location in the Northwest, the Northeast, the Southwest, and the Southeast, that kind of bounds a square that the plot is probably going to take part in. Whenever a local player says, hey, I request that local players, before they do something dependent on city knowledge, they just pass it by me first. Where they're like, oh, I happen to know that there's a gun store 2 blocks from here, so I'm going to duck into there and I'm going to quickly buy a shotgun, and then we're going to come back and we're going to deal with this out of control Vozd or something like that, or whatever the supernatural terror is. And I'm going to be like, okay, I will come up with some sort of role that represents that, how quickly they're able to find it, and whether or not their character knows, and just kind of go from there. I am a big fan of, instead of the Facebook group, the Pinterest board. That is kind of my go-to way to establish mood and theme. Do you do anything like establishing nodes or ley lines, or coming up with any other background facts of a city that you think characters would probably know about this thing, even if they're not actively using it right now?
Usually I try to have a couple of the main places, like the main supernatural places made up. So for Changeling, I tried to have a couple of freeholds set up, and in particular, the freehold that was the most powerful, and then the freehold that was gunning for power, and then the freehold that was goofy and stuff like that. I try to have a couple of places for players to use as reference points, and then we sort of build out from there. So for Wraith, we started with, well, here's this one citadel that's really old, and here's this one citadel that's really new that came in after the move bombing. And then the renegades are sort of in between these two citadels. And then we had to ask, well, where would the renegades go? And then we started making up stories about oh, here's this one bar, we have a bar called the 27 Club. It's that's where all the hierarchy citizens go. But there's another bar where all the renegades go, and so we just sort of spiral off and then bring it back in. The other thing that I find really useful, and my boyfriend is an architect, so he's going to tell me what this is after we're done recording, and I'm going to kick myself. But there is a kind of map, figure ground maps. If you Google your city and then the phrase figure ground, you should be able to find a type of map that only shows the foundations of buildings and nothing else. So if there is a park, it's just white space. If there is a street, it's just white space. And so if you want to talk about figuring out what's important and what isn't, I've found that figure ground maps really show a lot about a city that you don't usually see, because it's just the foundations of buildings in black.
Interesting. Yeah,
they're fun.
I'm pulling up one of Philadelphia, and immediately the 5 squares jump out, the empty area within. That's neat.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun. I too have a game in DC that's a lot about ley lines and power. And figure ground, we actually printed out a giant figure ground map of DC and used it as our West Marches style map, where we would just draw on it and stuff. It's really good stuff.
And DC as a city is interesting for the amount of open space, the nature of having so many memorials kind of creates, and the number of public gardens and squares and so on.
Yeah. And the streets are specifically designed to be super wide to account for not protests, but assembly.
Yeah.
DC's a whole nother ball of wax.
Interesting. I think for me, I want every character to have a way of accessing what gives them gas.
Yeah.
And a lot of that to me is ritual. What your character's version of reflection and communing with the past is, or if not that, some way of embracing their future. So it could be your character collects water from the Gloria Dei church, which is a very old Swedenborgian church in the city, or you have a conspiracy theorist character who collects pamphlets by the various Nation of Zion or the LaRoche guy who claims that Comcast is giving everyone cancer, that is their way of grounding themselves in their paradigm, and that is going to give them quintessence. I usually like focusing on the fact that, yeah, there is a lot of Masonic history, so ley lines aren't places of power, but they allow it to move. So if I were to say how much of the quintessence of the city is driven by nodes versus everything else, it's probably close to 50-50, where I think the default in Mage may be closer to like 90-10, where nodes are really the thing, and then there's these weird other ways. I want there to be a lot more ways of getting juice.
Exactly, because it's mundane magic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on board with that. I'm on board with that, even though I'm still figuring out how Ascension works and what Ascension does.
Yeah, it's a weird little game.
I'm digging everything that you're putting down, and I'm probably going to steal it. So hooray!
Run with that, John. To use our term.
There's no nodes, but there are Johns.
Yeah, I have 4 dots in John. What is a John? It's kind of a combination of talisman and ally and dream and avatar and node and fame and resources. Oh, okay. I want all of those things to tie to what actually happened in the city or what is actually happening in the city. Mage gives us 3 ways in which magical reality is created. This is a revised artifact, but it wasn't directly countermanded by M20, so I'm running with it. Most of it is what people believe. It is that consensus-driven reality thing. The second part is what has happened in a place. What is the memory of the land? What does history say? What do people think history says? And that is another thing. So the history of a place will also modify what is doable in some place. If you want to do a heroic act of last-ditch life magic, there's no better place to do that vulgar magic in downtown than before that Aiken's print painting that is just the last vestige of the heroic age of medicine. There's no better place in the city. There's no place where the paradigm will allow it more than that. And the last part is there are kind of rules of the universe, which are just the background supernatural thing. And for me, it breaks down to being like 65-25 10 in terms of the percentages there of what wins and how. And to me, like once I have those set up, the game and the city just kind of fall out the other end for me. I am very much a build the world and the story will fall out once the characters start running around.
Yeah.
Do you add any fictional locations? Like, are there any skyscrapers that don't actually exist or places that don't actually exist that you add to your game? Or I guess the supernatural places that by definition probably don't exist?
Usually it's just supernatural places. I'm a big stickler in the before times when we used to walk around Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. I'm a big stickler for walking around and using role-playing games as a way to enchant my day. Mm-hmm. So like being on a train station and looking out at an old factory that's got a lot of broken windows and a strange graffiti on it and wondering like, oh, I wonder what's there. I wonder what's hiding there. I wonder what's lurking there. Obviously there's nothing hiding there or lurking there, but like in my version of Philadelphia, what's there? I try to stick to the map as it is. I try not to add in extra places. Mm-hmm. There was a point when I didn't know the lay of the land when I was running a God Machine game in Philly that was disconnected from everything else that I was ever running. Mm-hmm. I just needed it to be near a hospital, and I couldn't remember which hospital I ended up needing, whether, it was Jefferson or whether it was one of the ones in West Philly. Mm-hmm. And so that just sort of became a couple of blocks that I made up. But I kind of regret that. Like, I regret not being able to look at the map and be like, okay, well, but it's this hospital, and on this street corner, there's this vampire who wants this thing. I get the impulse to do it, and it's probably useful under certain circumstances. I like the challenge of not doing it, I think.
I'm pretty well the same. I will accelerate or delay things. So for instance, there are a number of skyscrapers that are going up in the city of Philadelphia. If I need a place that doesn't seem to fit anywhere else conveniently, I will posit that skyscraper already exists. Or a lot of things happen the other way, where there's this super cool abandoned thing. Like, I don't care how long it takes to tear down the Divine Lorraine. That will be in my game for like a decade.
Yep, that's true. That's so true.
So the Philadelphia Convention Center was built above what was known as Reading Terminal because it's where the Southeast Pennsylvania Transit Association, which is where SEPTA gets its name from, and the Reading Railroad came in. and one was above ground and one was kind of below ground. That above ground became what was known as the Reading Viaduct, more or less abandoned. I have kept it abandoned. It is now a pedestrian linear park, a la the High Line in New York City. That's about it. Again, the advantage of a major city is just about everything you need is going to be in there somewhere, and that's kind of how I set up things. We've gone through most of our major things. Any final thoughts on Supernatural Philadelphia?
If you need anything, go to Atlas Obscura, because oh my god, is it such a great reference. And there are probably 8 other things that I'm forgetting that are on Atlas Obscura and ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ever need anything, just start with Atlas Obscura and then run.
Yeah,
run.
I think the big thing to me is always figure out what the demographic history of a city is. That sounds super boring, but a city that is growing and a city that is declining, and what neighborhoods were growing and declining when, will, to me, create a lot of natural information about what is happening in an area. The fact that Philadelphia was an insurance hub, for instance, is something that tells you a lot, that it had a financial center, that it was not stock-based. It was now growth of the Philadelphia contributorship, which was started by Benjamin Franklin, and that the old city is this particular area, which expanded to this larger area. The fact that a lot of our row home housing was built in 2 massive waves in 1923 and then in 1935 gives you a snapshot of what the architecture is going to be like and the bits that are going to kind of be frozen in place. And I just find being able to look at that gross history, gross in the sense of large scale. I don't really care about the events. The move bombing affected a lot of people and changed the way the city viewed itself. But I think in a lot of cases, like zoning changes that suddenly allowed multifamily dwellings or banned them in certain areas, is going to affect a lot of people too. And I think stuff like that really determines the character of a city. Cities tell stories. It is an interface of geography, human industry, individual stories, and weather and climate, and pick 2 or 3 of those to kind of understand. And I think a lot of story falls out the other end of that.
That's awesome.
And this is our first attempt at talking about a supernatural city. We kind of did it as a general outline. If this is an episode type you super find enjoyable, tell us. We'll do more of them. Maybe talking fundamentally about different kinds of cities, like how to tell mage stories in a small town, or in a megapolis of East Asia, or aboard a container ship or something like that. Other places that humans inhabit, or maybe just chantries in general. And with that, if people are interested in knowing what you're up to, Griffin, do you have an online presence that we can point people at?
Check out The Story Told, because I'm occasionally on there. I think that's the most I contribute online, but maybe I'll see if I can get my Instagram up and ready to go. My Instagram is griffin.a.horn if you want to follow me on there.
Nice. And if you're interested in listening to The Story Told, that is thestorytold.libsyn.com. Thestorytold.libsyn.com. Links to that will be in the show notes. Griffin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
You've been listening to Mage the Podcast, which is now taking 10 milligrams of loratadine daily to deal with seasonal allergies. The show is made possible by our executive producers, who include Anders S., Andrew K., Andrew E., Brendan, Bryce Perry, Christopher P., Chris Zach, Ira Grace, Jenna F., Justin B., John H., John Magnuson, Josh Golden, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, William C., William M., Jay Sunsern, Andy, Dan Svensson, Neil Patterson, Buck Farmer, and Isabel Castillo Lopez. Our EP call-out this week is to Neil Patterson, who I know nothing about, but I'm assuming Neil is interested in facts about mammal necks. Out of over 1,000 genera in the class Mammalia, all but 3 have 7 cervical bones, or neck bones, from humans to whales to giraffes. Those exceptions are the manatee, which generally have 6, and both extant sloth types. The 2-toed sloth usually has 6, and 3-toed sloths have 9. This got me curious about the number of neck bones in the giant ground sloth known lovingly as the Megatherium, which weighed 8 tons or about as much as a bull elephant. That guy appears to have had 7 on the skeletons that I could find. These massive creatures are likely part of the reason that avocado seeds are so large, as an 8-ton animal can pass an avocado seed whole without much difficulty. Next time you have some avocado dip, think of the Megatherium and Glyptodonts that died so that your guacamole could live. If you'd like to become an executive producer, like Neil, get a chat color in Discord, and have me make up things, except in this case where I didn't make up things, I just recited things that I had found out, become an executive producer of Mage the Podcast by clicking on Become a Supporter in the show notes or through the episode entries on our webpage. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com. We read every message. Or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We also read every message there. We have a hopping Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Podcasts, or the podcatcher of your choice. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now, go change reality. Bye.